Well, it took all semester, but we finally gotten into the area um, of economics that is nearest and dearest to my heart, and that's the international economy. The international economy tends to break up into two categories: international trade, sometimes just called international economics, and international finance. If you're interested in either of these, I teach classes here at RVCC in both, so I'd love to see you there. Um, but we're going to start with the international trade aspect of the economy. We'll get to international finance probably in the next lecture. All right, so let's move forward and see what the international is all about. There's some debate in the economics community, at least back in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as to whether or not countries should trade. There was concern during the mercantilist period, which was a group of economists back in that early period, late 1700s, early 1800s, that was concerned about making a profit for the country and making as much money as we can for the country. And so trade was a problem because if you sold goods overseas, that was great because money would come into your country. But if you bought goods from other countries, that would cause money to leave your economy. Again, we're back to leakages and injections. But so should you just sell and not buy? I'm not quite sure how that would work, but that's what they argued. Now, the question of whether or not we should trade, we'll come back to. So what we're going to start with is looking at what should you make in order to trade. Now, there are three theories that are the major theories about what you should make to trade. The first is the theory of absolute advantage. And the theory of absolute advantage tells us that a country should produce that good which it produces most efficiently when compared with its trading partner. We see the first or early indications of the theory of absolute advantage in The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. We're going to look at absolute advantage in a moment. But before we do that, let's look at the other two theories of what nations should trade. Shortly after the theory of absolute advantage, another British economist by the name of David Ricardo proposed the theory of comparative advantage. And the theory of comparative advantage tells us that a nation should produce that good which it produces least inefficiently when compared with its trading partner. Now, I know that's grammatically incorrect, but let's go with it this way. We'll see in a moment what happens if a nation does not have an absolute advantage. Ricardo argued, always go with absolute advantage first. But if that leaves you in a position where you have no absolute advantage, he argued that international trade was still doable, and we'll see that in a moment. The last major theory of international trade, or what nations should trade, is what its authors called the theory of factor proportions. The theory was first developed in the 19-teens, 1920s by a Swedish economist by the name of Heckscher. Heckscher then taught this theory to his graduate students. One of his PhD students was a gentleman by the name of Ohlin. And Ohlin went on to do work in economics and in the theory of factor proportions. Ohlin actually won one of the first Nobel Prizes in economics for his work. Heckscher was long dead by that point because I think Ohlin won it in the early 60s. Heckscher was long dead. Olean got the $1 million. Heckscher gets the credit. Economists today tend to call it the Heckscher-Olean theory, hence why I've listed it that way. But both Heckscher and Olean called it the theory of factor proportions. No matter what you call it, the theory simply states that a nation should produce that good which uses its most abundant resource. For example, the United States is capital intensive. We have lots of money. We have lots of technology. We should use that to produce goods. And we should sell those capital intensive goods for goods that are, say, labor intensive. Things that require lots of people power. Why? Why does this make sense? Well, if you use the resource you have in most abundance, you can produce at the lowest cost possible. So your goods are going to be cheaper when they go into the market. So you're going to have more demand for your goods. All kind of works out. Let's look at an example using the theories of absolute and comparative advantage. On your screen, you're seeing two production possibility curves. Very simple, straightforward, straight line production possibility curves. For two countries, England and Portugal. These two countries are being used because they're relatively the same size, and we assume have the same amount of resources. Now, if you look at England's production possibility curve, you will notice that if she produces only wine, she could produce 80 kegs of wine a week. If she produces only textiles, she could produce 100 bolts of cloth a week, or some combination of the two in between. Portugal, on the other hand, if she produces only wine, can only produce 30 kegs of wine a week using the same resources. Or if she chose to produce textiles, she could only produce 30 bolts of cloth. This presents a problem, right? If we use the theory of absolute advantage, England has an absolute advantage compared with Portugal in producing both goods. So what does poor Portugal do? Does she not buy anything? Does England not sell anything? Well, there's where the theory of comparative advantage comes in. If we look at what Portugal makes compared to England, we know that Portugal is inefficient in the production of both goods. All right? But where is her inefficiency the smallest? Well, if we look at wine production, Portugal can produce 30 kegs of wine, while England can produce 80 kegs of wine. That is about a 2.5 to 1 ratio between what? For every one keg that Portugal makes, England makes about 2.5. Now, if we look at textiles, if Portugal produces textiles, she can make 30 bolts of cloth, but England can make 100. So for every one that Portugal makes, England's making 3 1/3 bolts of cloth. So if we use the theory of comparative advantage, where is Portugal's inefficiency the smallest? Sometimes we look at this as opportunity cost, but the inefficiency is least in wine production. 2.5 to 1 versus 3 1/3 to 1. So, using the theories of comparative and absolute advantage, Portugal ends up having a comparative advantage in the production of wine. So we're going to let her make wine. And we give the comparative advantage of textiles to England. So from an absolute perspective, Portugal makes nothing. But from a comparative perspective, Portugal's going to make wine, England's going to make textiles, and we're going to trade. Before we can have trade, we need to know where England and Portugal stand before they decide to trade. How much of each good did they want? And unfortunately, for some reason, the numbers didn't show up here, but let's put in numbers here. England, before trade, wants 10 kegs of wine, but 70 bolts of cloth. Portugal, on the other hand, they also want 10 kegs of wine, but 20 bolts of cloth. They're both on their production possibility curves before trade. In order for trade to be worth their while, both of these countries have to at least get this amount of goods to be happy. Let's see what happens. Before we can trade, we needed to know some information. We just talked about how much of each of the goods each country wanted before trade. But there's something else we need to know. We need to know the terms of trade. And the terms of trade is simply how many imports can we get for 1 unit of an export. Right. So let's make some up. Let's assume the terms of trade are 1 keg of wine equals 2 bolts of cloth. Right? So in our trade example, England is going to make wine, Portugal is going to make wine, England is going to make textiles, and let's see with our terms of trade what happens. You have been selected to be the first Portuguese merchant to trade with England. Your country is making wine. It's using all of her resources to make wine. So she's making 30 kegs of wine. But she wants 20 bolts of cloth. So in order to get 20 bolts of cloth, given the terms of trade that you have, you need to take 10 kegs of wine to England. So you put 10 kegs of wine on your ship, you sail over to England, you take your 10 kegs of wine off your ship, and you put on 20 bolts of cloth. You come back to Portugal. Trade has occurred. Now, are the Portuguese and the British better off because of this trade? Well, let's see. You wanted 20 bolts of cloth. You've got that. You had 30 kegs of wine. You put 10 on your ship to go to England. That leaves you 20 kegs of wine. So you're here. But 20 kegs of wine and 20 bolts of cloth put you beyond your production possibility curve. You're in better shape. You've got more stuff. Well, let's look at England. England had 100 bolts of cloth. It gave you 20 in order to get the 10 kegs of wine it wanted. So it got its 10 kegs of wine, which it had before. But now, how many bolts of cloth has it been left with? It had 100. It gave you 20. That gave it 80. And so now with 80 bolts of cloth and 10 kegs of wine, England is also beyond her production possibility curve. Look, trade is good for everyone, whether you have an absolute advantage or you have a comparative advantage. This is wonderful. We have moved beyond our production possibility curves. Well, that's great, except for the fact that there is no country in the world that practices free trade.